In week 8, we talked about executive pay, and that is an interesting topic because it became a topic at the beginning of the corporate governance movement and has stayed, but our perspective on it has changed. So I'm sort of I gave you at the beginning a number of examples of recent cases where there was sort of a public reaction towards executive pay, and the reaction was that the executives are paid too much. We then had a look at how that compares with other people in the public eye, in particular sports athletes who are very prominent, and the question became one of, is that why should CEOs not be paid along the same lines? And we discussed that. So main question here is, why do we worry about executive pay? And the very big question, looking at the athletes we looked at, is it not important to attract talent? So should pay not be very high indeed? And then following on from that, how should this be regulated? The interesting observation about this topic is, so at the beginning in 1995, the Greenberry report spoke about aligning interests of directors with shareholder interests in promoting company progress. So that was a very clear agency analysis where the idea was executive pay is a tool through which shareholder interests could be better aligned with the personal interests of directors. And if you compare that to the 2018 Corporate Governance Code that adopts a very different tone, it talks about remuneration promoting the long-term sustainable success of the company, aligned with company value and purposes, and clearly linked with the company's long-term strategy. You note that shareholders have disappeared. So that's all about success of the company, sustainability, long-term strategy. Here you find some examples of how executives are paid in these two slides. I don't think I need to go through them. They're taken from the Moore and Petrin book, and you can sort of look them up yourself. There is sort of a basic component to it that's independent of any form of measuring performance, and then there are ways of integrating performance into the pay of executives. Now, the first question is, who sets the remuneration? Originally, that was shareholders, and then it allowed, so that the articles moved this to the board, and that, of course, moved, so that move put the setting of remuneration into a conflict of interest framework, because the board sets its own remuneration. And that, of course, means that they have a conflict of interest. The way to address the problem is the remuneration committee. So that would be, we spoke about board structure last week, and that is something that has to do with the idea that we set out a subcommittee with the responsibility for setting remuneration, with all independent directors, with a sort of requirement that the chair can only be a member of it if she or he was independent on appointment and must not chair the remuneration committee. And the chair also should have been on the committee for 12 months before they become chair. So that's an attempt to create a robust governance framework whereby remuneration is moved to a separate sub-body that is independent. So what does the committee do? The committee determines the policy for executive remuneration and sets the remuneration, meaning the number for the chair, executive directors, and senior management. And they also review the remuneration of the workforce and sets policies and aligns this with culture. So we see that the pay has moved into a sort of area where it is a tool to promote good corporate culture, a tool to enhance corporate purpose. Non-executive directors, important point. They should not be paid in a performance-related way, so that they are neutral in their approach to their job. Nothing the company does makes their reward higher or lower. So they are sort of taken out, if you like, of the performance-related rat race or the performance-related element of pay. Yeah, so the remuneration committee, here's something again from the corporate governance code. The idea is that they should be independent and they shouldn't delegate their responsibility to consultants. So they are by all means free to employ consultants, but they shouldn't delegate so they should apply their own judgment. Here again is the sort of the idea, that slide says some more about this idea about long-termism and sustainability, and it's the long-term shareholder interest that counts in this context. Okay, so there's these next two slides give you more information about what remuneration schemes. And one thing that came out of the financial crisis, and which this slide tries to address, or this, so the policy mentioned on this slide tries to address, that's the idea of reward for failure. So one problem that has emerged in the context of remuneration is that pay plans produced pay, or rather sort of the incentive plans produced pay that was independent of performance. So it turned out that it wasn't very easy to set a reward now and then wait for a future return and describe the future return now that would in the future trigger the reward. So the problem was that sometimes, for example, in the example of Persimmon, what happened was the company did really, really well, but that had nothing to do with the performance of the CEO. It just had to do with the fact that the government introduced a scheme that made house building much more attractive. And so that wasn't a reward for failure, but it was a reward that wasn't connected to the performance. And that's really very difficult to incentivize. And in other cases, reward was produced by the algorithm that created the number that was going to be paid as a bonus, in circumstances where the company hadn't actually done very well. So that's one issue here. And that's why we should not reward poor performance. And also, the remuneration should be robust in reducing compensation. So there's more here on the policy, which I don't think I need to get through. Here's again this idea of alignment with culture. And of course, disclosure, again, as a mechanism of ensuring that the shareholders are informed, but also of enabling some public scrutiny. So you see sort of disclosure of ratios, and so there's a sort of idea that the public, and it does work because the public, and certainly the press, pays attention to pay structures. Okay, so we've had this idea of reward for failure, and then there's another idea that has crept in during the financial crisis, which is this idea of pay incentives creating harm for the company. That's slightly different. It's not quite reward for failure, but it's sort of reward structures skewing executive decisions towards excessive risk taking. And so you find that rather than aligning the interests of the executives with the shareholders or with the company, the interests of the executives become sort of take on a sort of logic, a dynamic of its own, and that becomes a sort of vicious circle causing excessive risk taking. And you see here, post financial crisis, how can we stop, or how can we prevent this? And one idea was to ask to say on pay. So the idea was shareholders review the pay policy, and get a sort of a remuneration report, and pay needs to be based on a policy, and that policy is to be reviewed by the shareholders. And you see this set out here. So there's also a sort of increased disclosure. So, for example, a graphical correlation of the remuneration of the CEO with the recent performance, and also highlighting this relationship between the CEO's performance and the company performance. Okay, then for banks, for banks in particular, this problem of excessive risk taking as a result of the incentives in the pay structure of bankers, and you can see here what the answer to that problem was, or what was implemented as reform. So that the idea was that cash boni, so a bonus paid at a certain time in the future in a cash sum, causes short-termism, because it means that if you're an employee, you're highly incentivized by a very large cash bonus in the future. You'll do everything to get to that point, but you won't think beyond it. And that's the problem, the not thinking beyond that point, which creates a short-term focus. So there's a cap for bonuses to prevent this, and you can see here the measures set out. And then there's clawback rules. And here is something that the listing rules have done about long-term incentive plans. Yeah, so we say something here on severance payments, and the severance payments, they are important because they make it harder to remove directors. You remember that under Section 168, the shareholders can remove directors at any point with a simple majority. That's hard enough to do in a listed company, but becomes impossible to do, or very, very difficult to do in a listed company, if the shareholders know that removing a director triggers a very large severance payment. So that's sort of a knock-on area that gets attention under the Companies Act, because severance payments undermine the ability of shareholders to remove the directors. Now, looking at pay gaps, this is probably more sort of a social policy topic, and social justice topic, if you like. It has to do with a question of pay gaps between men and women, and the solution here is to say pay ratios need to be reported, and you can find the reporting here, and LSE's gender pay gap is sort of, there's a link here. So that there, the idea is that there is sort of a fairness across the population. Okay, looking at the themes, the first question is this a matter for shareholders? And to what extent is it a matter for shareholders? So you could take the view, this is a non-topic. We want to attract the best people, and we don't get those if we pay peanuts. So if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. Then you need to sort of justify regulating this at all. And there you would have to say, well, it looks like this is not there's sort of a reward for failure problem, and there is a excessive risk-taking problem. Transparency is an answer. You'll see from the readings that in some cases, or actually the effect of transparency efforts has been an arms race in pay. So pay has gone up because directors now know what their peers are paid in other companies, and of course, like any other human being, they want to be paid the same. And then I put this here as a question because I think it is a fundamental question. Does the public interest need to be considered? So is this not something for the private sector, for the private space? Why would anyone interfere anyway? And you can see that the UK hasn't really interfered, and European Union hasn't interfered either, except for in terms of banker bonuses. And has just said this is for the shareholders to review, and there is disclosure. So the question of, is it a question of incentives causing harm to the public interest, I think is one that you can ask in relation to bankers, but possibly also elsewhere. Maybe it is generally bad for the economy to have overly incentivized people working in the industry. And then it is a matter for social justice. If it is it even possible to take a view of what's just and fair? So this connects to a very big society question. What kind of gender pay gap do we accept? Or why do we not accept any gender pay gap? And if so, what's the right way of dealing with this?